If a picture is worth 1,000 words, doing an animated presentation is priceless.
People learn better from words and pictures than words alone. If you have a picture of something that illustrates what you're talking about, there's no greater power of persuasion than that, because it's imprinted on their minds. They remember it better when they've got the visual information at the same time that you're talking about whatever your point is. And that visual imprint on their brain is what helps to persuade them. People learn better when corresponding words and pictures are presented simultaneously rather than successively. Meaning you want the image up on the screen at the same time when you're speaking. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning to talk to fellow trial lawyers, people that we all have the same experiences, come from the same places, mainly believe the same kinds of things. So what I try to do is, first of all, try to get them to understand that our government is not the nicest people on earth. Now, I must admit I've loaded this slide a number of times, but I've never used it because I've always thought it's a little bit over the top, and probably the next one is too. But I like it because these prosecutors are always talking about they're the government. And I like to really explain what the government really is. Now, the next slide I have used many times. And I absolutely love this photograph, which is called Tank Man. And I don't know, I'm sure most of you know about this, but this is an iconic photograph that happened at Tiananmen Square with this man in the white shirt and the grocery bags goes out and stops the line of tanks. There's something about photographs. I love photographs. I love to use photographs. And I like to talk while putting them up there on the screen. Because if I'm talking about courage and standing up to the government and speaking to power, I can say it all day long. But this picture tells the story better than I can. A great picture tells a story. And this picture, to me, is one of the iconic photographs, and I love to use it because it really tells the story.
And let's face it, we all make mistakes. I make mistakes. I made mistakes during this trial. Remember how many times the judge overruled my objections? I make all kinds of mistakes. And I'm, of course, willing to admit it. Human beings are not perfect. We are imperfect creatures. All that is required of us is that throughout life, when we make mistakes, that we try to be better. We try to overcome them. We try to learn from them. In fact, isn't that what we do in life? Isn't that how we mature? By overcoming our mistakes and learning from them? And of course, that's the same thing with my life. There's no doubt mistakes were made in these contracts. That mistakes were made in bank accounts. That mistakes were made by bookkeepers. That mistakes were made in filing of returns. But these are not crimes. They are just innocent mistakes that cannot be punished as a crime. And the world's smartest people can make mistakes. None of us are immune.
One of the vignettes I like to use, although I use it then, but now people are not going to remember. When Barack Obama was sworn in as president, John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, administered the oath. And these two men, who were two of the brightest men on the face of the earth, two of the most accomplished men, two men who had prepared for this moment that was in front of I know I was there that day, I can't remember, at least 500,000 or 750,000 people live. It was on television being shown around the world, an incredible event in which Roberts was giving the oath and Obama was taking the oath, and the oath is 35 words long, and they got it wrong.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully.
that I will execute
Faithfully the office of President of the United
office of President of the
States.
United States faithfully
And will, to the best of my ability,
and will, to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Two of the smartest men on earth. And yet they want to put my client in the penitentiary for making a simple mistake on his taxes. And if I was arguing this today, even though I love Barack Obama, I would use Obamacare as my theme if I was arguing a mistake. A 15-year-old kid could have got this website correct, but not the United States government. And I love to batter the government. And I like to say that we have the intelligence agencies that we pay $30 billion a year to in order to give us information. And yet, what happened? We invade a country looking for weapons of mass destruction, and they don't exist. After spending $30 billion, that's what we get. In every case, I know that you argue presumption of innocence. And I'm always looking for new ways of arguing the presumption of innocence and reasonable doubt. And I'll get to reasonable doubt in a minute. But first is the presumption of innocence. We all believe that this is an absolute sacred part of our rights as a citizen to be presumed innocent when we're charged with a crime. And I like to tell them I remember learning about it in law school, about how great this was, and learning about Blackstone, about 10 guilty men should be let free before one innocent will suffer. And that has become a cliche. And guess what, ladies and gentlemen? The jury doesn't care what some judge 500 years ago had to say. What do they care about? When I argue the presumption of innocence, I talk about what's going on today. I said we used to presume people innocent, but not any longer. Because today we have people demanding that everybody is guilty. Everybody is a person of interest. Everybody is guilty of something. And you hear it all day long. The presumption of innocence has been devalued, diminished, if it even exists. And I like to tell them, think of the consequences of this. Think of what the DNA revolution has done in this country. Over somewhere between 300 and 400 people have been released from prison after they've been convicted by a jury, affirmed on appeal, because later they found DNA that proved they were innocent, actually innocent. Let's look at the Michael Morton case in Texas that people might remember.
In 1987, in a very public trial, Michael Morton was convicted of brutally murdering his wife. As he was led away to prison, he insisted he was innocent.
I didn't do this.
I'm sorry, what?
I did not do this.
Hardly anyone believed him. Until last year, when he was exonerated by DNA testing.
Let's go.
By then, he had spent nearly 25 years of his life behind bars.
25 years in jail, although he was totally innocent, and yet the jurors convicted him. And I say this is because the presumption of innocence no longer has any force and effect, and it's up to you to breathe life back into this rule.
It's not every day that a convicted murderer clears his name and then returns to court to argue that his prosecutor should be prosecuted. But that's what happened in a high-profile case in Texas that raises broader questions about the power prosecutors have and what happens when they're accused of misusing it.
Because it has been so much diminished, it's easy to convict people, and we load the prisons full of innocent people because we presume everybody's guilty. And everything, every little piece of evidence we look at in some type of a sinister way to say that this means that they are guilty. The DNA has exposed the flaws in our system of justice. Now I'd like to talk to you about reasonable doubt. Reasonable doubt, you argue in every case. The jury listens to the jury instruction on reasonable doubt. It is absolutely worthless. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't give the jury what you want to convey to it about how high a burden this is. There has to be some way of explaining this, and words seem to be inadequate. There has to be some way of getting it across to people. And I've struggled with this for a long period of time, and I'm going to go through here some of the evolution of my thinking on it. This is a PowerPoint on what reasonable doubt means. This is where we started, and it's totally worthless. This doesn't mean anything to anybody. This doesn't get across what reasonable doubt is. So we started thinking about how can we illustrate this. This little box, use that, pass that up right away because it really didn't work very well. Then we had this thing on levels that we thought perhaps would be a way of illustrating what's going on. Then I came up with this one. It looks like a Pythagorean theorem, a sort of a right angle triangle. And to be honest with you, after a while, I don't even know what this meant. So, if I can't figure it out, how can the jury? Then we started going to cylinders, which I like, are the nice colors, and to go through how, trying to get across to them how important this is. And we went through a number of different variations of this, which I think are interesting, trying to illustrate to them what it means. And then I got to degrees of guilt. That sounded good, sort of like this little thermometer over there, telling them, about how hot it had to be before they could convict. And then we would sort of, change that around a little bit. Sometimes the thermometer was low, sometimes high. Then I came up with this one. I like the colors of this one, but it really didn't have any power to it. It didn't show how difficult that it was. So we started working with this one. I like this because it has so many more levels. That's the real genius to it, trying to get them to understand how much it was. And so then we started adding some more because I really like this idea, and as many as we can put in there, I would want to put in there. And then finally the second to last one, I got this one. Because I wanted them to, anytime you can put not guilty up there and you have all these levels, it works good. But then I think there's a better way of doing this. So what I like to do is start doing them one by one. So when I'm talking about them, I actually put them up on the screen one by one, and I'm describing to them what this means, each one of these levels. Because I want them to think that in order to be guilty, it has to be so far beyond this as to be almost impossible to reach. And I think that's the way to illustrate what reasonable doubt is about. At least that's what I've been able to get to so far. And I've struggled with this, as I said, over the years, trying to figure out how to do it. And I wanted to talk to you about one other way of doing it. Back when I first started practicing law, there was a man named Jacob Bronowski. He was a guy who was a mathematician at the Manhattan Project, one of these absolute geniuses, but a polymath who studied virtually everything. And he created a program called The Ascent of Man, in which he described how mankind developed over the ages and discussed the great advances that occurred in man's thinking. And that's not what I thought was important, although it was a great series. There was a episode where he goes to Auschwitz.
Look for yourself. This is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers.
He goes behind the crematorium. And he's telling the audience that his family had died in the Holocaust, that they were probably ashes that came out of that crematorium. And he goes in the back of the crematorium, and he gets down into, there is a dirty, scummy pond there. And he walks into the pond, and he gets down on his knees. And I'll never forget this moment in which he goes down there and grabs up some of this mud, and he holds it up looking at the camera. And he wants to describe to them the horror of thinking that his family could be part of that mud from the ashes from that crematorium. And he's trying to make the point about the danger of men who are so positive in what they are doing, whether they're Nazis or Stalin or Chinese or whatever government it is. And he gets on his knees and he looks up at the camera and he quotes from Oliver Cromwell back in the 17th century, in which Cromwell was arguing against the death. And he quotes the words of Cromwell and said, "I beseech you in the bowels of Christ to think you might just be wrong." And I always thought that that was such a brilliant way of putting it together. Maybe better than this.
Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. And that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance. It was done by dogma. It was done by ignorance. When people believe that they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave. This is what men do when they aspire to the knowledge of gods. Science is a very human form of knowledge. We are always at the brink of the known. We always feel forward for what is to be hoped. Every judgment in science stands on the edge of error and is personal. Science is a tribute to what we can know, although we are fallible. In the end, the words were said by Oliver Cromwell. I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken.